mist still clung to the ridges of the Hudson Valley the morning the first truck came. It came in low across the fields the way mist does in September, when the summer has finally given up and the morning smell of turned earth and cold water. The old house on the Merrick property leaned slightly to the west, the way it had leaned for as long as anyone in the county could remember, and the bare arbor at the edge of the back field trembled in a wind that had not yet decided whether it was still autumn or the first cold breath of what came after. Inside the kitchen, an 18-year-old girl tightened the canvas apron at her waist. Her hands still carried the sweet fermented smell of the night before, and there was a faint dark stain across her knuckles where the juice had gotten under the skin and refused to wash out. She looked through the window above the sink, out toward the piece of land her grandmother had left her, counting down the days that remained before the county came for the taxes. From the head of the county road, a heavy truck turned in, tires grinding slowly over the loose gravel of the lane. She could hear it before she could see it. She could hear it the way you hear something you have been waiting for a long time. In the cab, the foreman was a broad-shouldered man named Garrett Voss, and he was already smirking before he had come to a stop at the gate. 6 tons of split grapes, one teenage girl on a piece of land no one had bothered with in 20 years. He had already decided, before his boots had touched the ground, that she would call her uncle by Friday. The girl stepped out through the kitchen door, and her rubber boots sank softly into the damp earth. She was not looking at the truck when it stopped. She was looking at the field behind her. She was looking at it the way someone looks at a thing they are still deciding how to understand. Her name was Hazel Merrick. She would have told you so if you asked, though she would not have offered it as either an apology or a credential. Simply as a fact, she was 18 years old, and she was standing at the entrance to her grandmother's land in rubber boots that had seen better days, with her hair pulled back tight against the wind. Garrett Voss rolled down the window and looked at her the way men in his position sometimes looked at people who did not appear to be what the situation called for. Then he said it, loud enough for the 2 men in the truck bed to hear, 6 tons to a teenage girl. She will call her uncle by Friday. The men in the truck bed did not bother to hide their laughter. Hazel turned around. She waited while the first crates were unloaded, watching them come off the truck one after another. Watching the fruit inside tumble against the slatted wood. Skin split open along the seams, clusters so dark with ripeness that the color had gone past any name that had a useful purpose. Grapes that had separated from their stems and sat in pools of their own juice, sweet and thick, and several days past what any winery would call workable. The smell was heavy, something between a harvest and the beginning of something else entirely. She crouched down beside the nearest crate. She picked up one of the split grapes between 2 fingers and held it there for a moment, feeling the way the skin had given way under the pressure of its own sugar, feeling the almost syrupy weight of it in her hand. Then she stood up and looked at Garrett Voss. "When can you start sending them again?" Garrett blinked. In 20 years of working the valley, almost nobody asked for more of what he was trying to get rid of. He opened his mouth, he closed it, he tried again. "You understand this is not a favor to you. This saves me a hauling fee. I understand Monday if you can, and if there is more the week after, send that too." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he got back in the truck. He drove off without much ceremony, and Hazel watched the dust settle behind him on the lane. To understand how that girl had come to be standing at that gate, asking for more of what the whole valley was trying to get rid of, you have to go back a little further. You have to go back to the woman who had raised her, and to a kitchen that smelled of cooking fruit and wood smoke, and to a life that had been quietly building toward this morning for longer than Hazel herself had been alive. Corinne Merrick had come up from the coal country of western Pennsylvania as a young woman, part of the steady northward drift that pulled generation after generation away from land. Their families had worked for nothing and towards something that at least offered wages. She had settled in the Hudson Valley with a husband who did not last and a stubbornness that did, and she had spent 40 years making a life out of the kind of patience that does not announce itself. She had raised Hazel because there was no one else to do it. Hazel's father had removed himself from the picture before Hazel was old enough to remember his face. Her mother had worked double shifts at a nursing home 2 towns over and slept when she could, which was not often enough. So it was Corinne's kitchen where Hazel grew up. Corinne's hands that braided her hair before school. Corinne's voice that was the last thing she heard at night, carrying through the thin walls of the old house. The kitchen was small and always a little cluttered. The kind of room that absorbs the years until every object in it carries a memory attached. There was a window above the sink that looked out over the back field, and in the evenings the light came through it in a way that made ordinary things look like they meant something. Hazel would sit at the kitchen table and do her homework, while Corinne moved between the stove and the counter with a patience that the world, Hazel had slowly come to understand, had mostly stopped rewarding. Corinne never bought the pretty grapes at the market. Every autumn, when the bins of summer fruit were being cleared out to make room for the root vegetables and winter squash, Corinne would appear at the produce stand with her cloth bags and her careful eyes, and she would go straight to the discount rack. The spotted ones, the soft ones, the clusters that had been passed over by everyone who came before her. She would buy the entire lot for almost nothing, and she would carry it home and begin. Hazel asked her once why she did not just buy the good ones like everyone else did. Corinne was standing at the counter when Hazel asked. She picked up one of the split grapes from the bowl in front of her, a cluster so ripe the skin had cracked along one side, and the juice had darkened the flesh around the break. She held it up between her fingers in front of the window and looked at it for a moment before she answered. The pretty ones already got somebody to love them. These ones need me. And the truth is, baby, the ugly ones are sweeter. It is the sugar that splits the skin. People look at a split grape and think it is ruined. I look at it and see something that finally got sweet enough to break open. Hazel was 12. She nodded the way children nod when they are waiting to go back outside. She did not understand a word of it. Corinne also kept vinegar. It was not something she talked about the way some people announce their hobbies. It was simply something she did, the same way she kept a garden and repaired her own porch boards, and knew by instinct when the pipes would freeze before the weather report said they should. There were glass jars of it under the stairs, dark and heavy, sealed with cloth and left to work in the dark. She had learned the practice from a neighbor woman when she was young, a German immigrant named Helga Brauer, who had kept barrels in her shed for as long as anyone could remember. Corinne had watched and asked questions and carried the knowledge forward the same way she carried everything forward, quietly, without ceremony. You cannot rush the sour, she had told Hazel one evening when Hazel had found her checking the jars and asked what they were. You can only keep the door open for it. It would take Hazel years and a mountain of rot before she understood that either. The summer Hazel graduated from high school, Corinne was still there, still in the kitchen, still buying the discount fruit. The graduation ceremony was held in the school gymnasium at the end of June, and Hazel's gown did not fit correctly across the shoulders. She sat in the third row and watched the people around her accept their diplomas with the settled confidence of people who already knew what came next. Some of them were leaving for college in the fall. Some had jobs lined up in the city an hour south, in warehouses and logistics centers and delivery routes that at least had a clear beginning. The plan was always the same. Go somewhere, become something, and do it fast. Hazel did not have a plan. What she had was a reputation, and it was not the kind you build on purpose. She was the quiet one, the one who was good with her hands and slow with a written test. The kind of student that teachers described with a small sigh and the word sweet, which in that town was the polite way of saying they had already decided she would not amount to very much. Most of them meant it kindly. That was almost worse. The one person in that town who never described her with a sigh was waiting at home with a pot on the stove. 3 months after graduation, on a cold morning in November, Corinne Merrick died quietly in her sleep, the way she would have chosen. She was 74 years old, and she had spent most of those years proving that a thing is not finished simply because it looks finished. The small and sad business of her estate took several weeks to settle. When it was done, Hazel learned what her grandmother had left behind. The house, which leaned slightly to the west and would need the foundation looked at before another winter. A few acres of land at the edge of the county that had been in the family longer than anyone could precisely account for. The shed out back, full of tools that had rusted at their joints. A modest envelope of savings, accumulated a few dollars at a time over many years and folded into the paperwork like something that had always been there. And a stack of property tax notices from the county, several years of back payments with a redemption deadline attached. By any honest accounting, it was a burden more than a gift. Hazel's uncle certainly thought so. Wade Merrick arrived at the house on a Tuesday afternoon in early December, and he did not come empty-handed. He was 54 years old, a practical man who had spent his adult life making sensible decisions and watching other people fail to do the same. He came through the screen door without knocking and set two things on the kitchen table. One was a folded printout of a job listing at a distribution center 40 minutes south. The other was something Hazel had not expected. It was a document, 4 pages stapled at the corner, with a company name printed across the top that she did not recognize. It took her a moment to understand what she was looking at. Then she understood. It was a formal purchase offer for the land, prepared by a real estate development company, signed already on the seller's acknowledgement line with Wade's name. He had not come to persuade her. He had already called someone, already arranged it, already put his name on a document that assumed she would say yes. The visit to the kitchen table was a formality. She did not leave you a farm, Hazel. Wade sat down across from her and folded his hands on the table the way a man sits when he believes the conversation is already over. She left you a problem with a deadline attached, and somebody is already willing to take it off your hands at a fair price. Hazel looked at the offer for a long moment. Then she looked at Wade. Then she looked back at the document. Grandma left this to me. She left you a headache. That is not the same thing. You went to a real estate company before you came here. Wade did not answer that directly. He tapped the document twice with one finger, the way you tap something when you want a person to stop looking at everything else and focus. The deadline on those taxes is not going away. You do not have the money to pay it. You do not have a business. You do not have a plan. The sensible thing is to take what she left you and turn it into something you can actually use. Hazel felt something close tightly in her chest, something she would not have had a word for if she had tried to name it. She looked out the window at the back field, at the old arbor her grandmother had fought the cold for every year, at the land that was still technically hers for a number of months, that she could count on her hands. She left this to me, Hazel said again, quieter this time. Wade stood. He left the document on the table. The screen door swung shut behind him. Hazel sat alone in the kitchen for a long time after he left. Outside the window, the afternoon light was catching the empty arbor, and the vines her grandmother had spent decades keeping alive stood bare against a sky that was going the color of old tin. She did not reach for the purchase offer, but she could not yet say exactly what she intended to do instead. She knew one thing. She knew that if she sold the land, she would become cleanly and permanently the thing that everyone had quietly already decided she was. She also knew that staying was not the same as knowing how to stay. Those were two different problems, and she only had an answer to the first one. The work of figuring out the second one started 3 miles down the county road. She walked it on a gray morning at the end of the week. She walked it because the truck her grandmother had left behind would not turn over in the cold, and she walked it because she wanted the time to think. And she walked it because there was something about arriving on foot at a place like Cordell Vineyards that she thought might matter, even if she could not have said why. Cordell Vineyards was one of the larger commercial grape operations in that stretch of the valley. The kind of place that sold to its own label and to bulk buyers, to wineries downstate that took their juice by the tanker. Every autumn they moved a great deal of fruit, but not every grape that came off those vines was good enough to sell. Some clusters came in overripe, past the sugar balance a clean wine required. Some rows ripened unevenly, a frustrating mix of tart and sweet on the same vine, useless for a consistent batch. Hail bruised whole sections. Birds got to others before the harvest crew could reach them, and in a heavy season, there was simply more fruit than the tanks could hold. All of this cost money to get rid of: hauling fees, diesel, tipping charges at a composting facility 2 counties over. It was a real and recurring expense. The man who managed operations at Cordell was a weathered and unhurried man named Wyatt Cordell, and he was standing at the edge of the loading yard when Hazel came up the drive. He watched her approach with the kind of attention a farmer gives to any figure that appears on a horizon he was not expecting. Pauline Beckett at the feed store had mentioned to him 3 days earlier that the Merritt girl had empty acreage and a tax bill breathing down her neck. Wyatt had done the arithmetic in his head. He had been on the verge of picking up the phone that morning. He had not expected her to save him the call. They stood at the edge of the vineyard on that gray morning with a crate of culls between them. Spotted and split and already releasing the first sweet smell of turning, Wyatt nudged the crate with the toe of his boot. Here is the offer, and it is the whole offer. You take them as they come. I do not sort. I do not grade. Most seasons that is tons of fruit. It will draw every wasp in 3 towns, and I am not paying you to take it. This saves me a disposal fee, nothing more. He waited for her to negotiate. Everyone negotiated. Hazel looked at the crate. She looked at the vineyard behind it. She looked at the drainage cut along the row ends and the way the light was falling across the far hill. How soon? Wyatt paused. That was not the question he had been expecting. How soon what? How soon can the truck start? He looked at her for a long moment. He was uncertain in that moment what he was dealing with. But he was also a man who had spent enough years in the valley to know that when a piece of luck fell into his lap, he did not need to understand it before he accepted it. Monday, Hazel put her hand out to shake. Send whatever you have. If there is more the week after, send that too. Wyatt shook her hand. He drove her back the 3 miles in his truck without asking whether she needed a ride. She did not thank him for it. That was not the kind of exchange either one of them was interested in. That evening, after the light had gone out of the field, Hazel went down into the cellar beneath the kitchen. She had been down there many times as a child, sent by her grandmother to fetch a jar of preserves or a length of twine from the shelves. She knew the smell of it, the dry cool that never changed, whether the weather above was hot or freezing. The particular quiet that basements have when they belong to old houses. She was looking for a length of clean cloth, something she could use to cover the bowl of grapes she had already carried inside. She had begun, without quite knowing why, to hold on to the ones that came home in her pockets, the ones that had rolled off the crates during unloading. She was not yet certain what she would do with them. She only knew she was not going to throw them away. The cloth she was looking for was on the second shelf. She reached past it without meaning to, and her hand brushed against something behind the folded linens that gave differently under her fingers. Wood, a box. She had not seen it before, or perhaps she had seen it 100 times without ever registering it, the way children do not register most of what fills the corners of the rooms they grow up in. She pulled it out. It was a wooden box about the size of a shoebox, its lid darkened with age, the corners softened by years of handling. There was no lock on it. There did not need to be. It was the kind of thing that belonged to a woman who trusted the people around her not to open it, and had been correct in that trust for as long as she was alive to enforce it. Hazel carried it upstairs to the kitchen table and sat down. She lifted the lid. Inside, stacked neatly, were notebooks. Spiral-bound, some of them, and cloth-bound, others, and one or two that were simply loose sheaves of paper folded and tied with kitchen string. She counted 8 in total. She opened the one on top. The handwriting was her grandmother's. She would have known it anywhere. The dates on the entries went back 40 years. Vinegar temperatures, barrel notes, observations about weather and yeast, and the particular character of grapes from different corners of the valley. The kind of accumulated attention that a person builds only if they have decided, without telling anyone, that a thing matters. Corinne Merrick had been keeping this record for 4 decades. She had never mentioned it. She had never shown Hazel a single page of it. She had apparently simply been writing it down year after year, in the belief, perhaps, that someone would find it when they needed to. Or in no belief at all, just doing the work. Hazel turned the pages slowly. She did not try to read all of it. She would not have understood most of it yet, even if she had tried. She was only letting her eyes settle on it, the way you let your eyes settle on a landscape you have not yet learned to walk in. At the bottom of the box, underneath the last notebook, was one more thing, a small brass key. It was not attached to anything. It had no tag, no chain, no ring. It lay by itself against the wood of the box, catching the light of the kitchen bulb overhead. She picked it up. It was cold in her palm, small enough that her fingers closed around it easily, and it fit no lock she could think of in the house. She sat at the table for a long time, holding the key in one hand and looking at the top notebook where it lay open in front of her. Her grandmother had left her a farm, a debt, and a job listing on the table, and this she did not know what to do with the key. She did not know yet what to do with any of it, but she set it carefully on the windowsill above the sink, in the place where the evening light would catch it in the morning, and she went back to the box. The truck started coming that Monday, and then again on Thursday, and then again the following week. Through the rest of the winter, they came whenever Cordell had a load worth moving. Through the spring they slowed. Through the summer, as the new crop set on the vines, they nearly stopped. Then September came around again, and the harvest broke. The trucks came fast and heavy in those weeks. More fruit some mornings than Hazel could have processed in a week of nights. And that was the part that made the whole town start talking. Word about what was happening on the Merrick property traveled through the county the way it always did, in a place where everyone still waved at the cars that passed. Within days, most people in the township had formed an opinion about the Merrick girl and the pile of rotting grapes growing behind her shed. Hazel's uncle called it playing house. A classmate from her graduating class, a girl who had gone on to study environmental science at a school upstate, stopped by in late September on her way back from visiting family. She stood in the driveway and looked at the steaming pile with an expression that she probably did not know was visible on her face. She said kindly that Hazel could still apply for the spring semester, that it was not too late. Then she took out her phone. And she photographed the grape heap, and she posted it to her social media account with a caption that she thought was affectionate. It drew more laughing reactions than she had intended. A neighbor, an older man who ran beef cattle on the property south of the Merrick land, pulled his truck up to the fence one evening and leaned out the window. He was grinning the grin of a man who thinks he is making an observation rather than a judgment. "You planning to bury something back there, Merrick? Because it sure smells like it." He drove off before she could answer, which was fine because she had not been going to answer. She stood at the edge of that steaming heap in the failing light and let them think whatever they wanted. Because she was not looking at garbage. She was looking at something her grandmother had spent 60 years trying to teach her. Sitting right there in a pile, waiting. The following evening, a truck she did not recognize parked at the north fence line. It was an old half-ton, faded to the color of old bark, and the man who got out of it was not young. He was 71 years old, though he stood like a man who had not consulted his age in some time. Silas Kettering had farmed the property adjacent to the Merricks for 4 decades, and in all those years, Hazel could not recall ever exchanging more than a few words with him. He was the kind of neighbor who existed as geography rather than relationship, a name attached to a boundary line. He stood at the fence and looked at the pile of rotting grapes for a while, not with the amusement of the neighbor who had joked about burial, not with the concern of someone who had opinions about property values. He looked at it the way an old farmer looks at soil, factually, as if he were assessing what it might be capable of. You know what those are good for, girl. Hazel looked at him across the fence. I am figuring it out. Silas nodded slowly. He looked at the pile a moment longer. Then he said something she had not expected. Helga Brower used to live down Mallet Road, had barrels in her shed for 40 years. Your grandmother ever mentioned that to you? Hazel went very still. Corinne had mentioned Helga Brower. Not often, not with a great deal of detail. But the name was there, in the part of Hazel's memory where her grandmother lived, attached to stories about vinegar and patience and things that take time to become what they are meant to be. Helga Brower was the woman Corinne had learned from, the woman who had kept barrels, the neighbor who had carried the knowledge north from somewhere older. Hazel opened her mouth to ask how Silas knew that name, but he was already moving back toward his truck, unhurried, in no particular rush to be anywhere but finished with what he had come to say. He was gone before she could get the question out. She stood at the fence in the quiet after his truck had turned back onto the county road, and she tried to understand what had just happened. In 40 years of living on neighboring land, Corinne had never once mentioned Silas Kettering. And Silas Kettering had just spoken Helga Brower's name like it was a word he had been carrying for a while, waiting to put down in the right place. She went back to the shed. She lit the work lamp over the old wooden table her grandmother had used for everything from canning to seed sorting. She pulled the top notebook from the wooden box and set it in front of her. She opened it to the first entry dated 40 years ago, when Corinne had first begun writing down what Helga Brower had taught her. She read the first page, then the second, then the third. She did not understand all of it, but she understood enough. She opened her own notebook to a fresh page. At the top of the page, she wrote one word, balsamic. Then she underlined it, and through the window of the shed, the last of the evening light caught the small brass key where it sat on the sill of the house across the yard. She had left it there where the morning would find it. She did not yet know what door it opened. She only knew, in the way a person knows some things without being able to explain how, that it had been placed in that box for a reason. Somewhere in the field behind her, the pile of grapes that the whole valley had thrown away kept slowly, patiently doing what grapes do when they are finally sweet enough to break open. And Hazel Merrick sat at the shed table with her grandmother's handwriting in front of her and the smell of the coming winter in the air, and she began. The first frost of that year came early, on a Wednesday night in the middle of October, and it took the last of the tomatoes in the kitchen garden with it. Hazel had known it was coming. The weather report had said so, and the sky had said so more clearly than the weather report. And the way the light had looked in the late afternoon had said so most clearly of all. She had covered the plants she could cover. She had lost the ones she could not. The morning after the frost, she walked the fence line to check the fruit that Cordell's crew had dumped the day before, and she was standing at the edge of the pile when she heard the engine of Silas Kettering's truck coming down the county road for the second time. He did not turn into her lane. He stopped at the fence the way he had stopped the first time, and he got out and walked to the wire the way an old farmer walks anywhere, at the pace of a man who does not owe the world any part of his hurry. He was carrying something. It was a glass jar, quart-sized, sealed at the top with a square of cloth held down by a length of twine that had been tied and reteed enough times to have gone soft at the corners. The liquid inside was so dark it was almost opaque. It caught the morning light along the rim and gave nothing back. He held it across the fence without preamble. My wife made this. Hazel took the jar carefully, the way you take something you understand as being trusted to you. She looked at the way the liquid moved when she turned it in her hand. It moved slowly. It clung to the glass on the way down. It moved the way a thing moves when it has been becoming what it is for a very long time. Silas was looking at the pile of grapes, not at her. Iona kept barrels in the shed out back of our place. 40 years, past 6 years ago. He paused. He looked at the jar for a moment, not at Hazel. Helga Brower taught her. Same woman who taught your grandmother. Hazel unscrewed the cloth top and lowered her nose to the opening. The smell was deep and layered, sharp and sweet at the same time. And underneath both of those was something older, something the wood had put into it that the grape juice alone never could have carried. She had never smelled anything quite like it. It did not smell like the sour brown liquid people bought at the grocery store in a plastic bottle. It smelled like a thing that had earned every year it had spent in the dark. She understood immediately that it was not the same as what she had been trying to make. It was what she was trying to get to. She looked up 40 years and nobody knew. Silas did not answer that right away. He was still looking at the pile behind her. The people who do this kind of work, he said finally, they do not usually do it for recognition. They do it because the thing itself is worth doing. He turned back toward his truck. Keep the jar. It will show you what the direction is. He was halfway across his field before Hazel thought to call after him. She stood at the fence with Iona Kettering's jar in both hands and thought about two women on the same county road, learning the same thing from the same teacher, working in separate sheds for 40 years, neither one of them ever saying a word about it to the other. She brought the jar inside and set it on the workbench in the shed. She did not open it again that day. She let it sit there at the edge of the lamplight while she worked, a reference point, a direction, something to aim at. The first thing she burned was the must. She had been standing over the pot for 2 hours by then, watching the grape juice reduce in a heavy steel pan she had found hanging from a hook in the back of Corinne's shed. Watching the color deepen from purple to a dark wine, red to something darker still. The process demanded patience above everything else. A long, slow application of steady heat that could not be rushed without consequences. Hazel understood that. She had read enough by then to know it in her head. Knowing something in your head and keeping it in your hands while standing over a hot stove at 11 in the morning with 3 other things demanding attention are not the same discipline. And she had not yet learned the difference. She went to check the drainage on the back field. It took maybe 12 minutes. When she came back into the shed, the smell had changed. It was the difference between a harvest and a fire. The bottom of the pot had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, from caramelized to scorched, to something accurate and final that filled the shed and sat in her clothes for 2 days. She poured the ruined must into the compost heap behind the building and stood there in the cold air with the empty pot in her hands. And she felt something very specific, not despair, not yet. But the particular frustration of understanding knowledge is not the same as skill. And that skill costs something before it becomes useful. She wrote it down in the spiral notebook she had started keeping beside the stove. In handwriting that was smaller and more careful than her ordinary handwriting, too hot, too fast, stay with it the whole time. She did not think of it as a setback. She thought of it as the first page of an education she was paying for herself. The second failure came 2 weeks later, and it was worse because it announced itself more slowly. The new batch of cooked must had cooled correctly this time in a clean ceramic crock she had ordered online with what remained of the household money. She had inoculated it with wild yeast the way the fermentation guides recommended, leaving the cloth-covered top in the cool corner of the shed where the temperature held steadiest. For 4 days it looked exactly as it should, the surface clouded. There was a faint fizzing at the edge of the cloth. She checked it morning and night the way someone checks on a sick child, and each time it looked like progress. On the 5th morning she lifted the cloth, and the smell that rose to meet her was not the sharp, alive smell of active fermentation. It was the flat, wrong smell of something that had been claimed by the wrong organism first. A pale gray film covered the entire surface, spreading from the edges inward, and underneath it the must had turned in a direction that no amount of patience was going to correct. She stood in the shed with the cloth in her hand and stared into the crock. She stared into it for a long time. Long enough that the light through the shed window moved across the workbench and reached the far wall. Then she went and got the bleach and the fresh water and the clean rags. She sanitized every surface she owned, twice, then a third time for good measure. She scrubbed the workbench until the wood grain came clean. She wiped down the shelves. She washed the cloth covers and hung them in the last of the autumn sun. The notebook got a new entry: sanitize everything before it touches the must. Everything, no exceptions. The 3rd batch fermented correctly. This was the one she let herself feel cautious hope about. The must clouded, sharpened, worked the way all the readings said it should. And over 2 weeks it built into something properly alcoholic, genuinely alive, something that made the shed smell like a place where something real was happening. She covered it with fresh cloth, made sure the temperature was stable, and gave it time. The guide said alcohol became vinegar when the right bacteria converted it. She gave it time, then more time, then a full month, then another week on top of that. Nothing happened. The batch sat alcoholic and unchanged, refusing to take the next step, and Hazel could not figure out why. She read the sections in her grandmother's notebooks that she thought might apply. She read them twice, then a third time. Corinne's handwriting had a lean-forward pitch to it, the way handwriting develops when a person has been writing for many years, and the words moved down the page in tight, economical lines that did not waste space. Some of what her grandmother had written she could not yet decipher. She would come to understand it eventually, but not yet. She sat on an overturned milk crate in the cold shed at 1:30 in the morning, the pot in front of her phone in one hand, and she wrote a question to an online fermentation forum with the particular clarity of a person who is tired and frustrated and cannot afford to stay frustrated. She was specific about what she had done. She listed every step. Then she went to bed. Harlan Piedmont called her the following morning at 8:15. He was 68 years old, recently retired from a working life that had involved, among other things, 2 decades of small batch vinegar production in a shed not entirely unlike the one Hazel was standing in when she answered the phone. He lived 2 counties north. He had found her post while drinking his second cup of coffee. He had seen her exact mistake before, he said, many times. And the fact that he was calling instead of just typing a reply meant, though he did not say this, that the question had interested him more than the average beginner's error. You sealed it up tight to keep it clean, didn't you? It was not a question. Yes, that is how you killed it. He said this without satisfaction, the way a man states a thing he has said many times and is no longer surprised by. The bacteria that converts alcohol to vinegar, they breathe, they require oxygen to do their work. You sealed the jar down and cut off their air supply. You did not protect the batch, you suffocated it. Hazel was already writing, so I take the lid off, cloth over the top. Something that breathes but keeps the insects out, and then you leave it alone. Vinegar is not something you make. It is something you allow. There is a difference, and learning it is half the work. Harlan stayed on the phone for the better part of an hour. He explained the mother culture, the living film of bacteria that formed on the surface of a healthy vinegar, that thickened over time into something almost rubbery, that could be skimmed and kept and used to start the next batch without ever having to begin from nothing again. He explained pH strips and why testing was better than guessing, and near the end he said the thing that changed the shape of what Hazel was attempting. If you want the real thing, Harlan said, not sour brown water, but the genuine article, you do not just make vinegar and bottle it. You age it in a sequence of barrels, each one smaller than the last, each made from a different wood. You move it down the line as it concentrates, season by season, and the wood gives it things the grape juice alone never could. That process does not happen in a year. Hazel already knew the aging timeline from her reading, but hearing it said plainly by a man who had actually done it made it land differently. How long until you have something worth selling, your young stuff? The 1 to 2 year product can be good and honest and worth buying. But the deep-aged reserve, the kind that finishes a dish at a serious restaurant, he paused. You are planting barrels for a version of yourself that does not exist yet. You have to be willing to do that. After she hung up, Hazel sat in the shed for a while without moving. Then she got up and went back to work. The barrels came slowly. She could not afford to buy them all at once. She could not afford to buy them at all. If she was honest with herself about the household savings and the tax bill, and the fact that every dollar she spent on anything was a dollar she was not putting toward the redemption deadline. But she found a man in the next county over who sold used barrels out of a lot behind his garage. Whiskey barrels, mostly, some cider. She picked the ones whose staves were still tight, whose hoops had not rusted through, whose wood still smelled like something worth aging vinegar in. She bought 3 that first month: oak, chestnut, cherry. She lined them up along the far wall of the shed, largest to smallest, the way Harlan had described. She filled the first one carefully. She topped up the space at the top with a splash from Iona Kettering's jar. Just a splash. Enough to seed it. Enough to give the bacteria something to work with. Then she covered the bunghole loosely with cloth, and she wrote the date on the side of the barrel in white chalk. She had built the beginning of something. Winter came in for real in the second week of December, and it settled on the valley the way winter always did up there, with cold that reached in through the walls of any building that had not been prepared for it, and with a stillness that lasted for days at a time between weather systems. The old house creaked as the wood contracted. The pipes in the basement made small clicking sounds at night that Hazel learned to sleep through. She banked the fire in the wood stove every evening and stoked it every morning, and she moved through her days with the particular alertness of someone who has learned to watch for what can go wrong when attention slips. She checked the shed temperature morning and night. She checked the cloth covers on the fermenting vessels. She checked the pH of the active batches and wrote the numbers in the notebook. She did not check the barrels. She had done everything else. She had learned the lesson of the burnt must and the lesson of the mold and the lesson of the sealed jar. She had listened to Harlan Piedmont and read everything she could find and built a system that worked. The barrels were the most important thing in the shed, the oldest work, the longest bet, the thing that contained not just fermented grape juice, but the accumulated time and care of every night she had stayed up past midnight, and every morning she had come out before the light, and every choice she had made to stay when the easier thing would have been to go. She did not check the barrels. The temperature dropped hard on the second Monday of January. It came down 20 degrees overnight and stayed there. For 4 consecutive days, the thermometer on the shed wall did not climb above 18. The wind came out of the north and cut through the trees along the fence line the way winter wind does when it has traveled a long way over open ground to get there. On the 5th morning, when the cold had settled into something almost stable, Hazel went to the barrel she had been aging the longest. The flagship of the small battery she had assembled. She worked the bung out with a wooden mallet and leaned in. The smell that came out was wrong, not sharp, not alive, not even the restrained sleeping smell of something aging through the cold months. Flat foul, the particular deadness of something that had been alive and was no longer the one that had been worked over by the wrong organisms while she was watching everything else. She stood very still with the bung in her hand. She had not topped up the barrel after the liquid level dropped. She had known about the angel's share, the evaporation that happened through the wood in every season, the empty space that formed at the top of the barrel and had to be filled, or else the wrong thing moved in. Harlan had mentioned it, she had written it down, and in the press of 100 other tasks, in the teeth of the hardest stretch of winter, she had let it slip. She stood in the cold shed and felt the weight of it settle in her chest. Slowly, the way certain kinds of understanding settle in, not all at once, but in layers, each one heavier than the one before. She had lost the barrel. She had lost the 8 months of work that had gone into the barrel. She had lost the batch that was supposed to be the beginning of the aged reserve. The one that would have been ready first. The one that would have proven, more than any of the others, that she knew what she was doing. She reached her hand out to steady herself against the barrel, and that was when she noticed it. She had not noticed it before. In 8 months of working around this barrel, in all the time she had checked the levels on the other vessels and walked past it without looking closely. On the iron hoop that encircled the top of the barrel, tied there with a length of kitchen twine so old it had darkened to the color of bark, was a small folded piece of paper. She worked it free with cold fingers. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was her grandmother's. The handwriting was her grandmother's. What it said was brief. Check after the first hard frost. Do not leave it empty. Corinne had tied this note to the barrel herself, years ago. Corinne had known. Corinne had left the instruction in the most obvious place possible, attached to the thing it applied to, and Hazel had worked around that barrel for months, without ever looking closely enough at the barrel itself to see what was hanging from it. She sat down on the floor of the shed, right there in the cold, with the note in her hands. She did not cry, not exactly. It was something quieter than crying, something that happened inside her chest without any sound at all. She sat on the shed floor with the note between her fingers and thought about her grandmother, not the version she had lost in November. The version who had been standing in the kitchen with her 12 years earlier, holding a split grape up to the light. The version who had known then that this was coming, who had prepared for it, who had tied a note to a barrel 40 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10, and left it there in the belief that someone would eventually walk into this shed and need to read it. Corinne Merrick had been trying to teach her from the beginning, and Hazel was only just now beginning to see how much of that teaching she had missed. She stayed on the floor for a long time. Then she got up. She lifted the folded note carefully. She carried it into the kitchen. She placed it on the sill above the sink, next to the small brass key she had left there weeks ago, where the morning light would catch both of them. She went back to the shed. She emptied the dead barrel. She cleaned it. She dried it. She left it upside down on the workbench because she was not ready to look at it standing empty in the line with the others. Not yet, and she wrote in the notebook, in ink that pressed harder into the page than her usual entries. Top up the barrels after every hard frost. Never again, she underlined it twice. The next morning, the certified letter arrived. She opened it at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold in front of her. Outside the window, the field was white with the frost that had not melted, and the light coming in through the window fell across the paper in a way that made every word on it easier to read than she wanted it to be. The letter was administrative in its language, measured, procedural, which made it slightly harder to understand at first, and then much harder to absorb. The redemption deadline on the property tax lien had been moved forward, not by a few days, by 60 days. The reason given in the careful phrasing of county paperwork was that a formal petition had been filed by a family member, raising concerns about the management and maintenance status of the property. She called the county office. She waded through 2 transfers. The name on the petition was Wade Merrick. Wade had not warned her. Wade had not called. Wade had appeared at her kitchen table months ago with a document already signed and a job listing already printed and a real estate company already waiting in his phone contacts. And when she had not done what he expected, he had filed a formal petition with the county to accelerate the process of taking the decision out of her hands. She drove to his house that afternoon. She did not call ahead. Wade came to the door before she knocked, which meant he had been watching for her. She stood on the porch and looked at him. He looked at her. Neither one of them said anything for a moment. The wind moved the bare branches of the maple tree beside the driveway. You went to the county. I have a legal interest in how a family property is being managed. You filed a petition without telling me. I told you what you needed to hear at that kitchen table. Wade said this without apology and without defensiveness. He was a man who had made a decision he believed was reasonable and was prepared to explain it. He was not looking at her the way a man looks at a niece he has wronged. He was looking at her the way a man looks at a problem he is trying to solve on a timeline that he considers to be entirely his own. You did not listen. The land is going to go back to the county for unpaid taxes, and you are going to end up with nothing. I am trying to prevent that from happening. Whose offer is on the table now? Wade did not answer, which was its own answer. Hazel stood on the porch for another moment. She looked past Wade into the house behind him, the house he had bought with the sensible decisions he had spent 40 years making. The house that was warm and paid for and quiet and had never, in her entire memory of it, felt like a place where anything worth remembering had happened. She turned around. She walked back to her truck. She drove home in a silence that had weight to it. She sat in the driveway for a long time after she killed the engine, and when she finally went inside, she did not go into the kitchen. She went straight to the shed and she went back to work, because the barrels needed her, and that was more true than anything Wade Merrick had said. The meeting with Gideon Straub was scheduled for the following Friday. She had arranged it 2 months earlier. She had been working toward it since November. Straub was the regional distributor, the man whose phone calls opened the accounts that mattered. The fine dining kitchens and the premium specialty shelves and the buyers who paid real prices for real products. A single agreement with Straub could have solved the tax problem twice over. She polished her boots. She drove 45 minutes south. She carried the best bottle she had. Straub gave her 4 minutes. His office was on the second floor of a low commercial building set back from the road. There was a plaque on the door with his name on it in raised lettering. There was a woman at a front desk who looked up when Hazel came in and did not smile. There was a hallway that smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Straub was on the phone when she came in. He waved her to a chair without looking up. When he finished the call, he leaned back and looked at her the way a man looks at a person whose value he has already calculated in his head. Hazel opened the small case she had brought and took out the bottle. She had labeled it herself in careful handwriting, with the date and the wood and the source. She poured a measure onto a tasting spoon. She held it out. Straub tasted it. He set the spoon down before he had finished. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has determined the value of a situation and found it low. It is fine for a school project. Come back when you are 30, and you have actually got a product. What you have right now is a young face and a nice story, and I will be telling every buyer I work with exactly the same thing. He was already looking at his phone. I do not put my name behind a teenager in a shed. Hazel did not argue. She did not defend the bottle. She did not explain the process. She did not tell him about the barrels or the notebooks or the note tied to the hoop. She had learned by then that some people were not going to hear a thing no matter how you said it, and Straub was one of them. She picked the bottle up off his desk herself, then she walked out. In the hallway outside his office, she stopped, because she heard his voice through the door, which was not fully closed. He was on the phone again. She could hear him say the name Merrick. She could hear the words, nothing to worry about. And let me know if she comes to you. He was not just refusing to carry her product. He was calling his buyers, one by one, to make sure they did not take her call. She stood in the hallway with her bottle in her hand and let this settle in. Not with surprise, something colder than surprise. The particular recognition of a person who has just learned that the door she was trying to walk through was never going to open, no matter how honest her knock had been. She walked to her truck. She drove the 45 minutes back to the valley, in a silence that was different from the one on the way down. On the way down, it had been nervous. On the way back, it was something else, something colder and more settled. The particular quiet of a person who has just understood the full shape of the problem they are facing. She had a dead barrel. She had a shortened deadline. She had a distributor actively working against her in a market she could not reach without him. She had a note from her dead grandmother tied to a ruined barrel. She had an uncle who had already decided what the right ending was. She parked in the driveway. She sat in the truck for a while. Then she got out and went into the house. She did not turn on the kitchen light. She stood at the sink in the last of the afternoon and looked at the small brass key on the windowsill, and at the folded note beside it, both of them catching what remained of the daylight. She did not touch either one. She went to the shed. The wind had picked up during the drive back. The county road at the edge of the property was empty. The bare branches of the arbor moved against a sky that had gone the color of iron. She walked past the compost heap and past the empty crates stacked against the shed wall. She unlocked the door. She stepped inside. The barrels were in their line along the far wall. She looked at the empty space where the dead barrel had been. She had not put it back yet. She had left it upside down on the workbench where she had cleaned it. The other four sat where they had always sat, and above them on the beam of the shed wall was the small hand mirror her grandmother had hung there decades ago for reasons Hazel had never understood. It caught the lamplight in a small bright square. She lit the work lamp. She sat down on the overturned milk crate. She did not open the notebook. She sat there in the cold shed with her hands on her knees and her breath visible in the lamplight. And she let herself think for a few long minutes about giving up. She thought about it seriously. She thought about calling Wade back and asking to see the purchase offer again. She thought about how quickly it could all be over. She thought about the job listing he had left on the kitchen table. She thought about a small, clean apartment in a town where nobody knew her. She thought about the relief of not having to walk into this shed one more time. Then she stopped thinking about it, because none of that was actually what she wanted. It was only what she wanted for a moment, when the weight of what she had chosen was pressing down harder than usual. It was the shape that surrender took in the mind of a person who was not going to surrender. She let it pass. She sat there until the shape of it had gone out of her. Then she looked up at the mirror on the beam. She saw her own reflection in it, small, tired, not much older than she had been 3 months ago, on the day of the graduation ceremony when the teachers had described her with sighs. But different. There was something in the eyes that had not been there before. Not confidence, not yet, but something that was going to be confidence one day. If she stayed, if she kept working, if she did not let Wade take this from her before she had built the thing she was building. Something. Underneath, she heard the sound of a truck outside. She had not heard the truck arrive. She had been too far inside her own head to hear it. But now the engine cut off in the driveway, and the door opened and closed, and a set of footsteps came slowly across the yard toward the shed. She recognized the footsteps. They stopped at the shed door. There was a pause, then a knock, 2 soft raps of a knuckle against the wood. Not the knock of a person who expected to be let in. The knock of a person who was announcing his presence and would wait to be told whether he was welcome. Come in. The door opened. Silas Kettering stepped inside. He was in his winter coat. His hat was in his hand. He looked at her, and he looked at the empty space where the dead barrel had been, and he looked at the note that was not there, but had been carried up to the kitchen windowsill. And he looked at nothing else, because there was nothing else in the shed that needed looking at. He did not sit down. He stood just inside the door with his hat in his hand and let the silence do the thing silence does when 2 people who understand something are in the same room together. Then he spoke. Mother Culture, still alive. Hazel looked at him. She thought about it. She thought about the surface of the ceramic crock and the thin living film that had formed on it over the last several weeks. She thought about the way it had thickened, the way it had started to look like something you could lift out in a single piece if you were careful. She had been feeding it. She had been checking it, in the middle of everything else that had gone wrong. She had kept the mother alive, yes. She said it quietly. Silas nodded once. Then you are not done. He said it the way he had said everything. Flatly, without ornament, as a piece of information rather than encouragement. He turned around. He opened the shed door. He stepped out into the cold. His footsteps crossed the yard. The truck engine started. The headlights came on. The tires ground slowly over the gravel of the lane as the truck pulled back onto the county road. Hazel sat in the shed for a long time after he was gone. Then she stood up. She walked to the workbench where the dead barrel sat upside down. She turned it right side up. She carried it back to the far wall of the shed and set it in its place in the line. She would not fill it again this year. It would need to be re-seasoned. The interior would need to be cleaned properly. There was work to do before it could be trusted again with anything worth aging. But she put it back in the line. Because the line was not 4 barrels. The line was 5, and she was not done. She went back to the milk crate. She opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote the temperature. She wrote the pH readings from the 2 working batches that were still alive. Then she wrote in the margin in smaller letters the words she had said out loud in the shed to Silas Kettering. Mother is alive. She underlined them. And she went back to work, because that was the only answer that had ever mattered. And because the note was on the sill, and the key was on the sill, and her grandmother had been trying to teach her something for a very long time. And Hazel Merrick had finally started to listen. Outside the shed, the wind moved through the bare arbor. The barrels sat in their line against the far wall in the yellow light of the work lamp. Somewhere down the county road, in a small, warm house, Silas Kettering was hanging his coat on a hook by the door and looking out the kitchen window at the light still burning in the Merrick shed a quarter-mile away. The night settled in. The valley went cold and still, and in a ceramic crock on a workbench in a shed that had been standing since before either of them was born, The mother culture kept breathing. Slowly, in the dark, the way it was meant to. The batch that finally worked came out of the smallest barrel on a Tuesday morning in October. 14 months after the first burnt must. 2 months after she had written the top-up schedule onto the wall of the shed in permanent marker where she could not miss it. Hazel had not been expecting it that morning. She had gone to the shed early because the overnight temperature had dropped, and she wanted to check the whole line before she started anything else. She worked from right to left along the battery the way she always did now, checking levels, checking cloth covers, checking the faint activity at the surface of the fermenting vessels. When she reached the smallest barrel, the one at the far end, where the vinegar had been concentrating the longest, she worked the bung out and leaned in. The smell stopped her. It was not the flatness of something ruined. It was not the sharp raw bite of something young and unfinished. It was layered, complex in a way she did not have a complete vocabulary for yet. Sweet and acidic at once, and underneath both of those something older and darker that came from the wood and from the time and from everything that had gone into making it what it was. She had smelled Iona Kettering's jar enough times by now to know what the direction felt like. This was not a school project. This was not something to apologize for. She poured a small amount onto a tasting spoon. She held it in the light from the work lamp. It moved slowly, thick enough to cling to the bowl of the spoon for a moment before it ran, dark as ink. Darker than the grape juice she had started with. Darker than anything that color should have been able to be. She tasted it. Then she sat down on the overturned milk crate and breathed for a while. She did not shout. She did not call anyone. She sat in the cold shed with the spoon in her hand and let the fact of it settle into her the way the vinegar had settled into the wood. Slowly, through pressure and time, until it became part of the structure, she had made it, or rather, she had allowed it. The way Harlan had said, she had kept the door open long enough and managed the temperature and checked the levels and stayed when it would have been so much easier to leave. And the thing had become what it was going to be all along. She understood for the first time, sitting there, what her grandmother had meant. Not about grapes, about everything. She drew off a small quantity into clean bottles and sealed them. She did not label them. She did not price them. She put on her coat and drove to 4 addresses that afternoon, and she left a bottle at each one without much explanation. Pauline Beckett at the feed store, the neighbor who had joked about burial, the old couple who ran the produce stand where her grandmother had always bought the discount fruit. And Wade, she drove to Wade's house last. She parked at the end of the driveway. She walked up the porch steps. She set the bottle down on the mat in front of the door. She did not knock. She did not want to be there when he opened it. She wanted him to have to find it on his own, to pick it up, to decide what to do with it. She turned around and walked back to her truck. She drove home in the last of the afternoon light. Pauline called her 3 days later. Pauline was not a person who handed out praise she had not earned. She had been running the feed store for 22 years, and Hazel could tell from the first second of the call that this was not a courtesy. Pauline had used a bottle on a pot roast. I have bought bottles from the fancy shops in the city. I paid real money for them. What you have in that shed of yours is better than what I paid for. And I want you to know that before you start thinking you should give it away. Hazel stood in the kitchen with the phone against her ear. She felt something release in her chest that she had not known was still clenched. She thanked Pauline. She hung up. She stood at the sink and looked out at the backfield for a long time. One honest person telling her the thing worked. After everything, that was the first moment she let herself believe it might. One of the small bottles she had given away made its way, by hand, through 3 or 4 kitchens before it arrived in the hands of a woman named Thea Whitcomb. Thea ran a farm-to-table restaurant 40 minutes south of the valley. The kind of place where the sourcing of ingredients was treated as seriously as the cooking of them. Thea had grown up around serious food. She had trained in kitchens where the standards were unforgiving, and she had been cooking professionally for 15 years. She knew what she was tasting. She called Hazel on a Wednesday evening. Hazel could hear the restaurant behind her, the organized chaos of a service in motion, and she could hear in Thea's voice a quality that was not excitement exactly, but was close to it. The controlled alertness of someone who had encountered something unexpected. I need to know who made the bottle that is sitting on my prep station right now. That is me, in a shed on my grandmother's land up in the valley. There was a short pause. I have tasted vinegar that costs more than some people's car payments. I am not being dramatic when I tell you that what I am holding right now should not be possible from where you are describing. It is a long story. The good ones always are. Thea's voice shifted into the practical register of someone moving from interest to logistics. How much can you produce right now, and how fast can I have a standing order? She became Hazel's first paying customer. Not a charity, not a favor. A professional chef who put a dark thread of the vinegar across the finishing plate of her tasting menu. a dish that people drove from the city to eat, and charged accordingly for the experience. The vinegar was not garnish. It was the note that resolved the composition. That order was the thing that forced Hazel to become an actual business. Because you cannot fill professional standing orders from an informal shed operation and remain informal for long, she registered the name within the week. Ember and Vine, for the fire that cooked the must, and for the fruit that started everything. She worked through the licensing requirements one form at a time. The health inspections, the commercial food production permits, the labeling regulations, all of the bureaucratic architecture that separated a person making things in a shed from a producer whose product could legally appear on a restaurant menu. She kept the labels simple: the year the grapes were harvested, the wood the vinegar had aged in, a single line about the source. She had learned that people wanted to know where it came from almost as much as they wanted to taste it, and that the shorter the explanation, the more it suggested that the thing itself was the point. She converted the old outbuilding behind shed into a proper production space. She sanded the floors, she painted the walls. She installed shelving that she built herself out of lumber she had found stacked in the back of the shed under a canvas tarp that had been there for longer than she had been alive. The lumber was oak, it was cured. It smelled when she cut into it like something her grandmother had been saving for exactly this. She began to move. The pile behind the shed had been diminishing all summer as she processed more of the fruit and less of it went to waste. The compost heap that the whole valley had joked about was smaller now. Cleaner, managed. The truck from Cordell still came. But Wyatt Cordell had started without being asked to set aside specific lots. He called her one morning to tell her there was a section of late harvest that was further along than anything else in the vineyard, and asked whether she wanted it. She drove over. She went through the crates with her hands, feeling the weight and the give of the clusters. The way she had watched her grandmother do at the discount bin in a market years ago. Wyatt stood beside her and watched. You want the ugly ones on purpose now. They are the sweetest, always were. She moved to the next crate. Somebody just had to want them. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, not to Hazel particularly, but to some private conclusion he had arrived at, and went to help load the truck. The production space took her the better part of the summer to finish. In September, she began moving things into it: the bottles, the labels, the pH strips and the temperature logs, the mother culture, now grown thick and dark, in its ceramic crock that she carried across the yard with both hands the way she would have carried a sleeping child. And on a Thursday afternoon in early October, she went down into the cellar of the old house to see what else her grandmother might have stored down there that could be useful in the new space. She had not been in the cellar in months. She had been too busy with the shed and the barrels and the fields and the ordinary work of staying alive. The cellar was cool the way it had always been cool. The dry air, the particular quiet. She moved along the shelves with a flashlight, sorting through jars of preserves that were too old to use, and coils of twine and cans of paint that had dried out in their tins. At the back wall behind a stack of empty crates, she found it, a small wooden cabinet, maybe 2 feet tall. Set against the stone of the foundation, she had walked past it 100 times as a child and never registered it. It was the kind of thing that belonged in a cellar and did not draw attention to itself. It had a small brass lock. Hazel stood in front of it with the flashlight in her hand. She looked at the lock for a long moment. Then she went upstairs. She took the small brass key off the windowsill where it had been sitting for almost a year. She had left it there the whole time, waiting. She had not known what it was for. She had known, in the way a person knows some things without being able to explain how, that it had been placed in that box for a reason. She carried it down into the cellar. She knelt in front of the cabinet. The key slid into the lock as though it had been made for it. Which of course it had. She turned it. The lock opened with a small dry click. She lifted the door. Inside the cabinet were 5 glass bottles. They stood in a row on the wooden shelf, dark liquid inside, sealed with wax at the top. Each one hand labeled in her grandmother's writing. The dates on the labels went back 25 years. Hazel sat on the cellar floor in front of the open cabinet and did not move for a very long time. Corinne had aged these herself. 25 years. She had been 49 years old when she had started them. Hazel had been almost ready to be born. Corinne had put these bottles in this cabinet, locked it, and hidden the key in the wooden box of notebooks where someone would find it eventually. Where Hazel would find it eventually if she stayed. On the last bottle in the row, beneath the date, was one line of handwriting. For whoever finally understands. Hazel picked up the bottle carefully. She held it in both hands. She thought about her grandmother, 49 years old, standing in this same cellar, sealing a bottle of something that would not be tasted for 25 years. Believing, without any evidence except her own quiet faith, that someone would eventually come down these stairs and open the cabinet and understand what they were looking at. Corinne had never mentioned the bottles. She had never hinted at them. She had simply put them here and trusted. And gone back upstairs to make dinner. Hazel carried the 5 bottles up to the kitchen. She set them on the table. She stood looking at them in the late afternoon light coming through the window above the sink. She was going to keep 4 of them. The 5th, the last one in the row, the one with the writing beneath the date, she was going to take with her to the county hearing. The county hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in December. Wade had filed the paperwork months ago, had followed it with supplementary documentation when the deadline was shortened, had arranged for a representative from the real estate company to be present in an advisory capacity. Hazel had been preparing for it since the day the letter arrived. She had her business registration documents, the signed contract with Thea Whitcomb's restaurant, the standing order from a specialty grocery that had taken 3 cases the previous month, the deposit receipt from the county tax office showing the partial payment she had been able to make after the first 3 months of real revenue. It was not everything owed. It was evidence of a direction. She had been building toward this hearing the way she had built everything else. One thing at a time, slowly, with the kind of patience that does not announce itself. She was ready. She was as ready as she was going to be. On the Wednesday night before the hearing, at 11 o'clock, she went out to the production space to draw off the samples she would bring with her the next morning. She wanted 3 bottles from 3 different barrels, so that whoever was on the committee could see the range of what the operation was producing. She unlocked the door. She turned on the lights. She walked to the flagship barrel, the one at the head of the working line, the one that had been aging the longest of all the current stock, the one she was going to draw the primary sample from. She worked the bung out, and the smell that came out was wrong, not the deadness of the barrel she had lost the winter before. Something different, something more subtle. A faint off note underneath the good smell that had not been there the last time she had checked. A hint of the wrong kind of activity. She looked down into the barrel with the work light. On the surface of the vinegar, along one side, was a thin pale film. Not the mother culture. She knew the mother culture. This was something else. Something opportunistic. Something that had gotten a foothold in the small breath of oxygen that reached the barrel through the imperfect seal of the bung. She stood very still with the bung in her hand. She had 8 hours before she needed to be at the county office. The best barrel she had, the one she had planned to build her entire case around, was contaminated. She could not present it. She could not risk pouring a sample from it and having someone on the committee taste something that was not what she had promised it would be. She stood there in the production space with the lights on and the temperature holding steady and the notebook of her grandmother's records open on the workbench in front of her. And she started to work. She did not panic, because panic was a luxury she could not afford, and she had learned that lesson in a shed the previous winter, on the floor with a note in her hand. She moved to the second barrel. She drew a sample. She tested the pH. She tasted it. It was good. Not the flagship, but good, real, something she could stand behind. She poured it into a clean bottle. She labeled it in her careful handwriting. She set it aside. She moved to the third barrel. She drew a sample. She tested. She tasted. She poured. She labeled. She moved to the 4th barrel. At 2 in the morning, she had 3 bottles, not the ones she had planned to bring. But 3 bottles she could honestly hold up in a room full of strangers and say, "This is what I make." At 3 in the morning, she went back to the kitchen. She took Corinne's 25-year bottle down from the shelf above the sink, where she had been keeping it since she had brought it up from the cellar. She held it under the light for a moment. She looked at the writing beneath the date, for whoever finally understands. She put the bottle in the case with the other 3. At 4 in the morning, she went upstairs. She lay down on her bed with her clothes still on and closed her eyes for 2 hours. She did not sleep, but she rested. And when the alarm went off at 6, she got up and made coffee and put on the clean shirt she had ironed the night before. And she loaded the case into her truck and drove to the county office. The room was small, the kind of room where counties made decisions about the things they took away from people. There were 3 committee members seated behind a long table at the front. There was a respondent's table on the left and a petitioner's table on the right. There were rows of chairs behind them for members of the public. Wade was already there when Hazel came in. He was seated at the petitioner's table with an attorney beside him, a man in a gray suit whose face she did not recognize. The representative from the real estate company sat behind them in the first row, his briefcase in his lap. The seats behind the respondent's table were empty. Hazel took her seat. She set her case on the table. She opened it. She took out her documents and set them in a neat stack in front of her. She took out the 3 sample bottles and set them in a row along the edge of the table where the committee could see them. She took out the 25-year bottle. She set it beside the others. The hearing officer called the room to order. Wade's attorney began presenting the case for acceleration of the lien process, citing the length of the outstanding debt, the assessed condition of the property structures, the inability of the current occupant to demonstrate a viable path to full resolution within the statutory period. He was methodical. He was thorough. He had done this before. Hazel listened. When he was finished, the hearing officer looked at her. Miss Merrick. Hazel stood up. She did not have notes. She had thought about writing notes. She had decided against it. She was going to say what she was going to say, and she was going to say it in her own voice. And she was not going to read from a piece of paper, because that would make it sound like it belonged to someone else. She looked at the committee. She looked at Wade. She began, "My uncle says my grandmother left me a problem. He said it in her kitchen the day of the funeral, with a document already signed. He has said it in other ways since then. He said it in the petition he filed with this office without telling me. He said it in every conversation we have had about this land." She paused. "But my grandmother did not leave me a problem. She left me a question. The question was whether there was anyone left in this family who was patient enough to answer it." She reached into the case. She took out one of the sample bottles. "I am 18 years old. I know that is what the record shows. I know that is what the committee sees when they look at me. I am not asking you to overlook that. I am asking you to look at what I have made in the 2 years since my grandmother died, on land that was going to go to seed if I did not do something with it, with fruit that this valley was throwing away." She held the bottle up. "This is Ember and Vine. It is aged 18 months in a battery of 5 barrels that I built myself from staves I salvaged from a used barrel lot in the next county. It is sold under a standing order to a farm-to-table restaurant that has featured it on their tasting menu for the past 6 months. It is carried by a specialty grocer whose repeat order I filled last week." She set the bottle down. She reached for the 25-year bottle. She lifted it carefully. She held it in both hands. "This bottle was not made by me." She let the committee see it in the light. "My grandmother started this batch 25 years ago. Before I was born, she sealed it. She wrote on the label that it was for whoever finally understands. She hid it behind a locked cabinet in the cellar. She left the key in a box of notebooks where she knew I would find it eventually. If I stayed," she looked at Wade. She kept looking at him. "She did not leave me a problem. She left me proof that patience is a real thing, that it produces real results, that the work worth doing is not the work you finish yourself. It is the work you continue on behalf of someone who started it before you." She set the bottle down beside the others. "I have made partial payment on the taxes owed. The receipts are in the documents I submitted to the clerk. I am running a licensed and inspected business on this land. I have contracts, I have distribution. I have a mother culture in my production space that traces its lineage back to a woman named Helga Brower who was making vinegar in this valley when my grandmother was younger than I am now." She looked at the hearing officer. "The property is not in decline, it is in production. There is a difference. And I think everyone in this room, if they are honest, knows what that difference looks like when they see it." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Wade's attorney said something in a low voice. Wade did not answer him. Wade was looking at the 25-year bottle on the respondent's table. He was looking at it the way a man looks at a thing he did not know existed, that he should have known existed, that his mother had made with her own hands and had not told him about. The hearing officer conferred with the other 2 committee members. They spoke quietly for a moment, then longer than that. 22 minutes passed. The hearing officer looked up. "The petition for accelerated lien processing is denied. The existing payment timeline is maintained. Ms. Merrick will be given standard written notice of the remaining balance and the standard statutory deadline." He tapped his pen once on the desk. "We are adjourned." Hazel gathered her bottles. She put them back into the case, one by one, carefully, the way she would have carried anything valuable. The 25-year bottle went in last. She closed the case. She stood up. She walked out of the room without looking at Wade. She walked out into the winter sunlight on the steps of the county office and stood there for a moment, breathing, feeling the cold on her face, feeling the case in her hand. She had done it herself. Nobody had come to speak for her. Nobody had needed to. She had walked in with what she had built and what her grandmother had left her. And she had said what needed to be said in her own voice, and the committee had listened. A week after the hearing, Wade drove out to the Merrick property. He did not come to the shed. He did not knock on the kitchen door. Hazel saw the truck from the window above the sink and watched it stop at the end of the lane. Wade did not get out. He sat there for a long time. Then he leaned across the passenger seat and set something on the fence post at the head of the drive. He turned the truck around and drove back down the county road. When Hazel walked out to see what he had left, she found the empty bottle. The one she had put on his porch mat the afternoon of the first successful batch. He had used it. Every last drop of it. There was no note. There did not need to be. Hazel carried the empty bottle back to the kitchen and set it on the shelf above the sink. Next to the small brass key, next to the folded note in her grandmother's hand, she left it there. Some conversations end without words. Wade had made his in the only language he had left. The revenue from Ember and Vine's first full operating year cleared the remaining tax balance with enough left over to purchase 2 additional barrels and replace the aging cloth covers on the fermenting vessels with proper purpose-made equipment. The land was hers cleanly in a way it had not been since the day Corinne left it to her. She paid the county in full on a Thursday afternoon in late spring and drove home through the valley with the receipt in the passenger seat and the particular lightness of a debt discharged. She did not celebrate particularly. She went home and checked the barrels. Gideon Straub called her office line on a morning in June. 2 years after the meeting where he had given her 4 minutes and told her to come back when she was 30. She recognized the number. She let it ring through to the machine. Then she called him back. He came to her. He drove up from the city on a Tuesday. He arrived at the production space she had converted from Corinne's old outbuilding. A clean and properly licensed operation now, with labeled shelving, temperature-controlled aging areas, and a front section where she received trade visitors. He was dressed in the way of a man accustomed to setting the terms of rooms. He looked around the space with the careful attention of someone reassessing a situation he had previously misread. I want to be straightforward with you. My accounts have been asking for your product by name for the past several months. I have had buyers contact me looking for Ember and Vine because they saw it on a menu or found it on a specialty shelf, and I have had to tell them I do not carry it. That is a position I cannot maintain. Hazel looked at him across the tasting counter. She had refinished the counter herself over the previous summer. A solid piece of walnut that had come from a barn beam on the property. It sat between them now as a fact of the room. She set a tasting spoon on the counter. She poured a measure of vinegar onto it. She pushed it across. Taste first. Everybody pays the same for a spoon in here. Straub looked at the spoon. There was something in his expression in that moment. A slight adjustment. The look of a man encountering a situation that had reversed itself from what he expected. He picked up the spoon. He tasted it all the way through. He did not set it down early. When he looked up, his expression had completed whatever rearrangement it had started. Hazel named her price. She named her minimum order quantity. She named her lead time and her delivery terms, and the fact that the reserve product, the longer-aged batches, was available only in limited allocation and was distributed on a waiting list. That she maintained herself. She named each of these things in the same tone she would have used to describe the weather. Because they were facts about her operation, not requests for his approval. That is the number, same as everyone pays. Take it or leave it. Straub was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had spent 20 years in a position of deciding what reached the market. And the experience of sitting on the other side of terms he had not set was not one he was accustomed to. He looked at the spoon, then at Hazel, then at the room around them. I would like to carry the full line. Including the reserve. The reserve is allocated. I can put you on the list. He accepted the terms, all of them. He signed the distribution agreement she had prepared with no modifications, because she had written it correctly the first time. And there was nothing in it to negotiate, except whether he was in or not. After he left, Hazel stood at the counter alone for a while. Then she went into the aging room. Along the far wall, the barrels sat in their lines, smaller to larger, left to right, each one marked in her own handwriting, with the wood type and the year the vinegar had entered it. At the far end, the largest barrel, the head of the line, the one the whole battery flowed from. The chalk on its side had been refreshed twice since the first winter she had put it there. Because chalk fades, and she was not willing to let it, Corinne. She had never told Straub what the barrel said. She had not turned around to point at it during their meeting. She had not mentioned her grandmother's name or the kitchen or the discount bin at the market. She had made a business that spoke for itself, and the business was the only introduction Corinne needed. Hazel had built a second battery along the opposite wall of the aging room. A separate line, 6 barrels, smallest to largest, not for sale, not this year, not next year, not for a decade at minimum. She had built this line the old way, the 12-year way, the way Harlan's notes described. In the patient language of someone who had understood from the beginning that the best work is not the work you will see finished. She moved the vinegar down the line on the schedule she had built. Season by season, she topped up the Angel's share on the morning after every significant temperature change. Because she had learned that lesson at the worst possible price, and she was not going to unlearn it. At the head of that second battery stood the mother barrel. The chalk on its side was fresh because Hazel had refreshed it that autumn, standing in the aging room on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, with a stick of white chalk, tracing the letters her grandmother's name made in the cold air of the room. Corinne. The first true draw from that battery would not be ready until Hazel was past 30. She had done the arithmetic without meaning to. She was a young woman building something for a version of herself she could not yet picture. The same way her grandmother had kept bottles in a locked cabinet for years before Hazel was old enough to find them. The same way Iona Kettering had worked in a shed for 4 decades without telling a soul. Every night before she left the production space, she walked the length of the aging room. She checked the cloth on the fermenting vessels. She checked the levels in the working line. She checked the temperature against the thermometer on the far wall. And then she stopped at the mother barrel and put her hand against the wood for a moment, the way she had done on the worst night. The night she had almost called Wade and said the words he was waiting to hear. The wood was cool under her palm. Inside it, something was working slowly and without announcement, becoming more itself. With every season that passed over it, she thought about Corinne at the kitchen window, about the light that came through it in the evenings, when the ordinary things in that small room looked like they meant something. She thought about what it means to see worth in a thing at the exact moment the world decides there is none left. She thought about the split grape held up to the light, and the patience it takes to understand that beauty and sweetness are not the same event, that they happen at different times, and that the people willing to wait for the second one after the first has passed are rarer than anyone admits. Corinne had known this her whole life. She had known it about grapes and about vinegar and about a quiet granddaughter that the teachers described with a sigh. And she had held the knowledge without ever forcing it on anyone, trusting that time would do the work that words could not. She had been right. She had been right about all of it. It had just taken a mountain of thrown-away fruit, and a girl stubborn enough to stay, for the rest of the world to finally taste it. The barrels kept working through that winter, and into the spring, and the spring that came after it, and all the seasons beyond. Each year the vinegar moved a little further down the line. Each year a little more of what the grapes had been became what the barrels were making them into. Something that had no name for what it was before it started, and no resemblance to the rejected fruit it had come from. Each year the angels took their share, and each year Hazel gave it back. She checked the mother first every night, without exception. That was the promise. That was the whole of it.